Hi, I'm Todd Kelman. I'm a veterinarian and engineer in the Maurice Pitesky Lab, School of Veterinary Medicine at University of California, Davis. I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to view this video on the safety of backyard chicken eggs post-urban wildfire. Before we get going on that topic, I would just like to thank both UCANR and the USDA for funding this research. I also want to point out that that's our contact info there, those two email addresses you see on your screen, for any follow-up questions that you might have after viewing it. All right, so with all of that out of the way, let's just get right to the big question. Can eggs of backyard poultry be contaminated by urban wildfire? What contaminants are we even talking about? And why did we get so specific in saying urban wildfire? In this case, to distinguish it from a forest fire that doesn't involve urban or suburban areas. Let's think about all the different things that can burn in an urban wildfire as opposed to a forest fire, and we'll be able to answer both of those questions. The first is this. Think about any vehicles that might burn on a property and all the things that could be released when those vehicles burn. Think about all the petroleum products, the gases and oils, the various fluids like transmission and brake fluid. Think about all the lead in a typical car battery. There's a lot of it in there, order about 20 pounds or so. Think about all the possible heavy metals, and by heavy metals, we mean things like arsenic and cadmium and mercury and lead, things that can cause a wide variety of ailments in sufficient doses. Those heavy metals can be found in places you wouldn't necessarily even expect, like the electronics, even the tires, all of which have some potential to be abruptly released into the environment upon burning. Next, consider what might be found in a home, especially an older one. Is there plumbing that was installed before 1986? That could have a higher amount of lead in it. Is the paint from before 1978? Same thing. Even if the home is relatively new and doesn't pose these lead concerns, think about all the various construction materials that go into building a home and what those might contain. Think about whether there's any pressure-treated lumber in use. While CCA, or chromated copper arsenate, was banned for use in pressure-treated lumber back in 2003. There's still plenty of it out there, and it's a potential source of arsenic release upon burning. Think about all the appliances, electronics in a household that might burn, all of which contain some or all of those heavy metals we discussed when talking about vehicles. And something like this older couch that might contain fire retardants, which in California were actually required in furniture before 2015. If something like this does manage to burn, and those fire retardants can only do so much, those can be released into the environment. There's concern that at high enough doses, these substances, one of which is known as PBDEs, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, may affect the thyroid in the liver, also may affect the developing brain. Now, this is a really good time to point out that these fire retardants are completely different substances than the red stuff that's dropped from airplanes during firefighting activities. Those types of fire retardants, one brand name you might have heard is called Phos-Chek. Those are not reported to be hazardous once dispersed. So I just want to make that distinction clear so there's no confusion. And then we also have to think about substances like PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. Haven't even been manufactured in the United States since 1979, but can be still found in old transformers, old hydraulic oil, old fluorescent light ballasts, old oil-based paints, and all sorts of other places. And PCBs can persist in the environment for decades, earning them and other similar compounds the distinction of being called persistent organic pollutants. These substances have been demonstrated to cause a variety of adverse health effects, including cancer. So that brings us back to our question, can these substances make their way into eggs of backyard poultry? How do we even know that this is a possibility? That chickens exposed to ash and smoke from urban wildfire could produce eggs with substances like heavy metals or fire retardants or other intoxicants in them. Do we even need to be concerned? Initially, we began with a hypothesis, and that hypothesis was composed of three parts. And the first part was this, a paper from researchers at one of our state veterinary diagnostic labs detailing that lead had been found in eggs of backyard poultry. This has nothing to do with wildfire. The lead was from a variety of sources that we'll discuss throughout this presentation, but it's basically a proof of concept that chickens exposed to lead can produce eggs with high lead egg content. So the next piece is research like this, a study showing that heavy metal content of ash from urban wildfire exceeds human health-based screening levels. So now you have the first two pieces of the puzzle, that something like lead can indeed make its way into the egg, and that we truly do have a potential source of exposure in ash from urban wildfire. So if you combine those two pieces with what we know that chickens do all day, which is this, peck off the ground for hours on end, you've got the making of a pretty good hypothesis that urban wildfire could pose a risk for the production of eggs from backyard poultry that contain heavy metals or those persistent organic pollutants I told you about, and that the risk could increase the closer you are to an urban wildfire event. So what comes after a hypothesis? Well, you have to test it with experiment, and that's exactly what we did. We put out a call all over the state towards the ends of 2017 after the wildfires in Napa, Sonoma, and Ventura counties for submissions of eggs from backyard poultry, whether those premises have been affected by wildfire ash and smoke or not. And we got a ton of submissions, about 344 premises in all. That's what all those orange dots are you see on your screen, with an average submission about 5 eggs per premise. And we tested them for all those substances we discussed and more. It's hard to tell much from this zoomed out view, except to say that there's a fairly good representation from both fire affected areas and non-fire affected areas, which is a little bit of foreshadowing. If we zoom into one of those fire affected areas, here's the Napa and Sonoma region, and in red, the outlines of the Tubbs, Nunn, and Atlas fires. We got submissions from a lot of properties here, 75 from Sonoma, 16 from Napa. And note that none of these properties directly burned in the fires, but all were heavily impacted, blanketed by ash and smoke. And so what do we find? Well, out of all the things that we tested for, the most significant finding by far was the lead content of the eggs. About 8% of those 344 premises, that's 27 properties, had an average egg lead content that exceeded the FDA recommendation for daily intake by a child. So the key question is, where were these properties and what was their relationship to urban wildfire? So here we are back at the Sonoma-Napa region. On this map, the size and the color of the dots represents the average lead concentration in the eggs. What we want are small green and yellow dots because that indicates no to very low levels of lead. And what we don't want are big orange and red dots indicating a higher lead content that exceeds that FDA threshold I told you about. So here's the key. What we're looking for to support our hypothesis is a distribution of the big orange and red dots closer to urban wildfire and the smaller green and yellow dots farther away. And that's just not what you see here. In other words, when we ask ourselves, does this data support our hypothesis that proximity to urban wildfire is a driving force for lead in eggs of backyard poultry? And the answer is no, it really doesn't. If we zoom out to our whole state view again, we can see some of the largest and reddest dots, meaning those with the highest lead content in their eggs, in and around Sacramento, Stockton, and in LA. These were not sites directly impacted by ash. And they were certainly impacted by smoke, but by comparison to those premises in Napa, Sonoma, and Ventura, not so much. So right now you're probably all thinking, well, if it's not wildfire, well, then what is it exactly? Where is the lead coming from? And we did do a follow-up study to assess possible risk factors, and issues like having an older structure with lead-containing paint or being near a potential source of lead like a major highway, because remember that gas used to contain lead, were associated with high amounts of lead in eggs. So here's a question that's likely on your mind after hearing all of that. So does that mean it's safe to eat the eggs from your backyard poultry if you've been affected by wildfire? And because of all the different variables that go into what your particular exposure is, think about all those different things that can burn that we talked about in the beginning, plus all the non-wildfire related causes of lead in eggs. We can't give you a definitive answer to that question. But what we can do is tell you how to assess your risk and how to reduce your risk from those eggs. And this is how you would go about assessing your risk. The CAS lab, the California Animal Health and Food Safety Laboratory System. We have 4 of these around the state. The link for them is on our website, and I'll give you that at the end of our talk. They're also very easy to Google. If you're from out of state, your state has a state veterinary diagnostic lab just like this. Just Google veterinary diagnostic lab and put in your state name, and they're easy to find. So what you do is you send them eggs to be tested for heavy metals. We're going to use heavy metals as sort of our marker analyte for all the other substances we talked about. That test runs about $60, that's 60, so it's not exactly inexpensive. Your best bet is to send them about 4 to 5 eggs to be pooled, meaning they'll mix them all together and you'll get sort of an average heavy metal content over those 4 to 5 eggs, which serves the purpose of assessing your risk. And CAS will also send you info about how to interpret those results. If you're a California resident and have chickens that are ill or have died, you can also send them in up to two chickens for a necropsy for a reduced fee. And you may be able to obtain a heavy metal analysis if CAF deems it to be warranted for your particular situation. So contact your nearest CAS lab for all of those details. So that brings us how to reduce your risk. And there's various ways we can do that with poultry. The first and most important is just knowing what's in your soil, getting it tested. Now, there are all sorts of fabulous resources on the UC A&R website to help you with that, such as this, the Healthy Soils for Healthy California page, which has all sorts of fabulous information about soil health and testing. And you can reach that site here. Don't forget, you can pause the presentation to jot that down, and we'll also insert a link in the description below. And then if your property is directly burned in wildfire, there are federal, state, and local resources to help you test and remediate your soil. Those vary by where you live, but I've provided a couple of links to guidelines for both Sonoma and Napa residents, so you can get a feel for what agencies might be involved and how the process works. So the next risk reduction strategy is to keep food confined and off of the ground. Most chicken feeders are not great at doing that. The food might start out off of the ground, but a lot of it ends up there eventually, and that's exactly what you don't want. So a feeder like this does a much better job of keeping food away from the soil. And speaking of feed, one other thing you can do is make calcium available, like free choice oyster shell. That can prevent absorption of lead. Next thing you can try, keep chickens confined to a particular area in the yard if you can. Even better, put them on raised beds with fresh soil that you know is free from contamination. So definitely know the source of any soil you obtain to do this with. And know what's going into your chickens. And my primary concern in this regard is the water supply. So be educated about your water supply, whether it's municipal or your own well. Know how old your plumbing is. If there's any concern, I encourage you to test the water out of your faucet for lead at a commercial lab facility. We'll have links for accredited labs on our website. And I recommend if you have a particular spigot out by where your chickens are, that you test that water as well, just in case the plumbing and fixtures associated with that particular spigot are older than your house plumbing. All right, so how can you learn more about all things poultry, including those wildfire related? Well, we have a website that looks just like this. Give you the link for that in just a moment. On our website, we have all sorts of resources for backyard poultry folks, including wildfire specific ones. We have a link to our new YouTube page that has our previous talks. We have a link to our app on the Google Play Store that covers all things backyard poultry related. And you can find us at this URL right here. You can write that down, or even easier, you can always Google UC Poultry. UC as in University of California. We are always the first hit if you do that. All right, so that brings us to the end of the video. Thank you all again so much for your time. Thank you again to UC A&R and the USDA. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions that you might have. Take care.